All right, so we are in Parshat Va'era. Good morning, everyone online. Nice to see you. Shabbat Shalom. We are in Parshat Va'era, which in Eitz Chaim begins on page 351. So I have a number, we're gonna move around a little bit in the Parsha. I got a number of different things that I wanted to touch on.
Is hearing aid, maybe? Yeah.
Good morning.
It's hers.
What, not last?
It begins,
I'm very busy. We were in Israel.
Vayidaber Elohim el Moshe, and God spoke to Moses and said to him, Vayomer Elav, and said to him, Ani Adonai. Ani Yud He Vav He. I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name, Yud He Vav He. In fact, Eitz Chaim here doesn't even bother to translate it in this, elsewhere it does, but here it just leaves it Yud He Vav He. Because this is the mystical name of God. It is God's name, which is written in
What page are we on?
352.
Oh, 3.
Which is written in a way that is not fully comprehensible to the human intellect. And of course, the commentary says that's precisely the point, that we can never know God in God's fullness, right? That's beyond our human capacity. I think there are far simpler things that are beyond my human capacity, but that's a different story. And
Can think of a few.
and we can never fully know God, understand God, comprehend God, and so even God's name remains mysterious.
However, it never says that in the Torah.
Well, that's right.
Okay, and that's good. I asked this question before. Why do we not, why doesn't it say, don't mention my name? And so why don't we mention why? Just why?
What do you mean we don't mention, I'm not getting your question.
We don't mention the literal name of God. We say Yud Vav we say, I don't know, I always say Hashem, any other name except for what his actual name.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
It's not Elohim, it's Elohim. We always.
yeah,
Well, that's,
you know, that's been my question, or where it doesn't say that in the
where's
Torah
it
at all,
written?
not to mention his name.
no, but there's lots of things that come up later in Jewish tradition, which as a result of studying and interpreting the Torah, we decide that since we make decisions about those things. This is one example of that. I'm gonna go in a little bit slightly different direction. I think when we're all done, I'm still not gonna have answered your question. You'll see people in English write G-D. Now, in Jewish renewal circles, it's become fashionable. I did this for a little while, then I outgrew it. G exclamation point D. That's kind of cute.
Wow.
Now, in English,
Saw that.
in English, yeah, you don't travel with hip rabbis. That's right. In English, there is absolutely no reason to do this. I know a lot of us grew up doing it. I know that in 3rd or 4th grade, my Hebrew teacher, Mrs. Chazen, told me that's how you have to write God's name. Nonetheless, in English, there's no reason to do this. The prohibition is in regard to writing Yud He Vav He. Now, I mean, one of the reasons we don't say it, isn't really a reason we don't say it, but it's unpronounceable. We don't know exactly how it should be pronounced, right? The Jehovah's Witnesses went with in English Jehovah, and lots of Christian denominations went with Yahweh, but in Jewish circles, it is the case, right? That unless we're reading from the Torah or studying Torah, it's become customary to avoid pronouncing God's name. It's an extra caution, I would say. It fits into a category of rules which come out of a tradition that's called fence around the Torah. You're all familiar with this. We have a core rule in the Torah, and in order not to violate that core rule, we extend the prohibitions, if that's what it's about. You know, if it's something we're not supposed to do, we extend that prohibition. And that way, if you don't cross the outer boundary, you can never cross the inner boundary. It's why you light candles traditionally 18 minutes before sundown. You can light candles up until the split second before sundown on Shabbos, right? But you could make a mistake and then you could miss that opportunity. And now, so we back it up 18 minutes, right? So the custom in most, and certainly among American Jews and Jews elsewhere also is at the end of Shabbat, we wait 45 minutes until after sundown. It makes Shabbos 25 hours and a few minutes. But you know, what's the core tradition? You wait until you see 3 stars. So if you go out and see 3 stars, you don't need to wait 45 minutes. I looked out my window this morning. I don't think there's any chance of us seeing 3 stars. That might have been the grayest day looking out my window. And my wife, who sees the world through wonderful, optimistic glasses, it's a mixed marriage in that regard. She looked and she said, "It's not gray. That's the winter aesthetic. And the trees, they're like chocolate covered." I was like, I don't know, it just looks gray to me. So this is, I think it's really just grows out of this fence around the Torah that we expand. You know, it's the same example I use sometimes with religious school kids is right around, if you have a pool in your backyard, right? Right around your pool, you're gonna have a little concrete, what do you call it? Not patio, but a walkway. And then around that, you're gonna have a fence and, right? And so it keeps people from falling in the pool accidentally. So it's a fence around the Torah, but which I don't feel particularly bound by. So, you know, when I'm studying Torah, I'll use the words Adonai and Elohim. And of course, it is fun to read and watch and listen to people who want to use an alternative to see all the different wonderful creations they come up with. You know, you can sing Ein Kelokenu, you know. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of Canaan, which they lived as sojourners. Now, I want to just, you can read this on your own. I want to jump ahead though. Here we go to chapter, same chapter, but verses 6 through 8. I'm just skipping. I'll just read it. I have heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Verse 6, this is what I want to get to, 6 through 8. Say therefore to the Israelite people, Ani Adonai, I am the Lord. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements. By the way, we're setting the stage here. We're setting the stage here to make it clear, and the Haggadah at Pesach reinforces this in a very intentional and intense way, that while Moshe may have led the people, Moshe did not redeem the people. The redemption came at the outstretched arm of God. You say, "Oh, God has no body." Don't worry about that, right? We got to put it in the terms humans can understand.
It's wonderful, Larry. He announces in advance that, hey, you think you're gonna go easily?
What? Hang on.
Extraordinary.
Chastisement, right? We're gonna get there. The God, Moshe was operating as God's agent, if you will. It was not Moshe that freed the Israelite slaves. And the Haggadah makes this point. The traditional Haggadah, depends what Haggadah you use at Pesach, whether it retains this tradition or not. But the traditional Haggadah, which of course is the work of the core of the Haggadah, is found in the Mishnah. And then the rabbis post-Mishnah in the Gemara develop kind of the rest of the Haggadah, which, as you probably well know, is really just an evening's curriculum for retelling the Exodus story and to engage the people around the table, particularly the children. So what they leave out of what they noticeably leave out of the Haggadah is Moshe's name. You can look high and low in the traditional Haggadah, there's no Moshe. He got ripped off. That's a terrible thing. But that's the way it is. So the Torah sets that up here by making it clear. Good morning. That I will free you from the labors and deliver you. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements, and I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. V'lakachti etchem li la'am. I will take you to be my people. V'hayiti lachem le'elohim. And I will be your God. Vidatem ki ani Adonai Elohechem, and thus you shall know that I am the Lord your God, Homotzi etchem, who brought you out of the burden of Egypt. Now, I found an interesting comment in this. Many times I've looked at this book, I never noticed it before. On page 352. And you know that in this commentary, after the text and below the line is whoever the commentator for that book is. And I think each of these books has a different commentary. I think there's 4 commentators for the 5 books. I believe, it says in here, I believe this one is by Nachum Sarna. But below the line, throughout this book, is a commentary, what they call the Midrasha commentary, written by Harold Kushner. And
He gave the money for the book.
and among other things. And here, I never noticed this before, a Hasidic under labors of the Egyptians. A Hasidic interpretation understands the Hebrew word for burdens, which is what it says here. Sivlot Mitzrayim, the burdens of Egypt. In other words, the sufferings of being a slave. But here, the commentary says, burdens is understood as tolerance. What was the worst part of slavery? The Israelites became accustomed to it. They lost sight of the fact that one does not have to live in such conditions. The first step toward liberation will be freeing themselves from their passivity and their tolerance of the intolerable. Yes.
So I'll just throw in something from our recent civil rights tour, which was in some of the exhibitions and discussions we had, the question comes up, why the civil rights movement when it happens? And
Why-
the answer, why does the civil rights movement happen when it happens instead of earlier, for example? And the answer given is that after the experience of World War II, where Black soldiers are fighting side by side with white soldiers, and Black women are working factories or other jobs side by side with white women, and suddenly
Right.
you're no longer accustomed to Jim Crow.
This commentary from the Hasidic tradition speaks to the phenomenon of internalized oppression. That if you are oppressed in whatever setting, if the oppression is intense enough, long enough, that the oppressor ultimately no longer needs to oppress you because you internalize that and you do it yourself, right? And
I have one more thing to add to that, if I may.
just half a second, and then you do it yourself, and it becomes normalized.
Yes,
And yeah, we're gonna go to Ivan, and then yes.
it has to do with freedom means responsibility. You have to take responsibility for yourself to make a life, to do what you need to do. In Egypt, and people who were slaves don't have to make those decisions. They become dependent on others, and they actually get to a point where they are more comfortable not having freedom because it doesn't come with the responsibility. I mean, this is one of the explanations for why people still, they live in, countries, oppressive countries like Russia and China and so on, and they have a culture and a long history of no no participation in their politics and their government.
All
They're just run by others, and that's why it's easier for them. There was a book, The Brothers Karamazov, I'm sure you read, that was about that.
Right. Let me go, yes.
He has tremendous
So,
insights.
What this also reminds me of is, my parents would tell the stories of, my Orthodox forebears, if you will, coming from the old country to here and immediately dropping the shmata, so to speak. Why? Because they didn't have to dress like they were oppressed anymore. They could dress, they were making a living, they could dress more nicely than that. Ironically, in my neighborhood, I'll try not to make this sound as judgmental as it seems to be coming out. There are people who now put on the shmata because that's the way Jews dress.
It's just one comment, because it becomes sexist. And that is one of the shmatas that they would wear with house coats with a zipper. And we were at a retired rabbis convention at an Orthodox hotel in Miami Beach. And one of the women became friendly with her. I could ask her these questions. She was a Bover who had come from a Satmar group. And I had seen her in Shabbos clothes to kill, but she worked in advertising in New York City. I said, why do you wear a zipper, a house dress like that? It's because they're weaning their children all day long. So it's easier to unzip to feed the baby, to nurse the baby, which makes some sense.
Okay.
But, but we shouldn't denigrate that outfit. And I'm sure some of the people today who are wearing it don't realize it.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
bring us
that's
back
why
to
I was trying to be non-judgmental, just suggesting that there are different reasons
Right.
why somebody takes off a certain type of
you
clothing
would-
and puts it back on.
You would accomplish that goal better if you didn't call them schmutters. That's what just be my only observation. I want to
That's
come
what my
back to,
parents called
I
me.
want to come back to our text.
Up there.
Yeah. Who's up there? That's Nelson? Go ahead.
Well, being a kind of a cynic, it suggests that if we are oppressed, we don't know it because we're used to living this way. How do we find out we're oppressed?
That's an aspect of internalized oppression. That's right. You no longer feel the oppression because that's what you're living. That's the normalcy.
But what is normal for one is not necessarily
Well,
normal for another person.
well, that's true in every
In
situation.
other words, walking to shul for some people is a burden. For others, it isn't.
So I want to finish up here with this. I will take you to be my people, blah, blah, blah. I will bring you into the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession, I, the Lord. But when Moshe told this to the Israelites, they would not listen to Moshe, their spirits crushed by cruel bondage, right? That's another aspect of slavery, is the breaking of the spirit. Now, here's what I wanted to say about that. I've been a fan of the show West Wing for since it was on the first time. I've watched and rewatched the episodes because they're on Netflix or one of the streaming services. And in season 4, episode 2, which I have not committed to memory, I just had to look it up to see which it was for the sake of accuracy. The 3 of the president's staff, his chief of communications, Toby Ziegler, and his deputy chief of staff, Josh Lyman, and Josh's assistant, Donna, I forget her last name. They missed it's campaign season, and they missed the presidential plane back to Washington. They're out, I think it's supposed to be Indiana, but they're stuck out in the Midwest somewhere. And they missed the plane back, and the whole actually, it's one of the few episodes where it continues over 2 episodes. It takes them 20 hours through a variety of mishaps to get back to Washington, DC. And at one point, the president says about his 2 key advisors, he says something like, 400 IQ points between them. If it weren't for Donna, they'd still be out there in the, cornfield somewhere. And they're trying to get back and they miss, they're on a train going the wrong direction. They're going to miss the flight they've arranged from wherever they were headed to get back to Washington. And Donna says to them, we're not going to make the 6:15. That was a pipe dream. That was folly. Now, I've watched West Wing enough times, and of course, Sorkin has a Jewish background. There's a lot of Judaism in West Wing. And even the stuff that's not directly Jewish, there's a lot of Jewish sensibility, because that's how he was reared. That's true in all of his shows.
I missed the last word.
Folly. We're
That
not
was
going to
folly.
make it the 6:15. That was a pipe dream. That was folly. Okay? She delivers it much better than I do. And what calls out to me about this is this feels to me like what Moses must have experienced. God tells him, this way I'm going to free you, extraordinary chastisements, my outstretched arm. And Moses goes and tells the Israelites, and they're like, nah, I'm not, and I feel like, Moses in his private conversation with God would go back and say, God, what you told me, that was a pipe dream, right? That was folly. Nobody's buying that. Now, so that's just my comment about West Wing, because I like to work that in every opportunity. But the more serious point that I want to make is, for a variety of reasons, including the notion of internalized oppression, we often can't imagine a solution to our problem. That's where people get stuck. And so there's a lot in this, there's a lot in the Torah in general, but in this parsha in particular, there's a lot of psychologically astute and sensitive material about how we work and operate. Hang on half a second. In other words, we're in a situation, this is why we don't do our best in crisis. We're in a situation and we cannot see alternative solutions to just the problem in front of us. And we get stuck there, right? And a lot of times we need someone to help move us out of that space to be able to see alternative solutions and other ways to fix our problems and so on. So the Israelites are it's evidence of they're so oppressed, they're so broken, crushed, the translation uses here, by the suffering of slavery that they can't imagine any other way. Yes.
What I was gonna say is that this is an idea I had, that God had to harden Pharaoh's heart for the 6th through 10th plagues, or 6th through 9th, I guess. It wasn't because Pharaoh, all the reasons that they give for why God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It wasn't because Pharaoh wasn't ready. It wasn't because the Egyptians weren't ready. It was because the Israelites weren't ready. They needed more convincing
Okay.
that God was God.
Sheila, yeah.
What this reminds me of is, we always talk about Moses. What did he know? He's suddenly leading the Jews. And he was in the palace. What did he see? And it occurred to me while you were saying all this is that we need new life. In other words, the value of Balei Teshuvah, people who return to orthodoxy, people who are converts, people who have come from outside, bring fresh life.
Right.
One of the advantages of Chabad, for example, if you notice a lot of these other rabbis, all these Jewish experience and all those things.
Yeah, step lightly, that's what I do.
They are led by people who have not always been, many of them, who have not always been Orthodox, or their parents have not always been Orthodox. So they know another life. And they're able to bring new ideas.
Well, good. I want to go back to what you began with, because it's the perfect segue from what I wanted to move into next. which is in verses 9 through 13. We're on 353. I read 9 already. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, go and tell the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites depart. Moses appealed to the Lord saying, the Israelites would not listen to me. My own people wouldn't listen to me. How then should Pharaoh heed me? Ani aral svatayim, a man of impeded speech. We're going to come back to that in a moment, but that's at the point I want to make at the moment. At this right now, I want to say something else. Moses questions God. How my own people wouldn't listen to me. Why in the world is Pharaoh going to pay any attention? And I want to go in a little bit of a different direction from the literal, what's going on literally here, and talk about, and this goes to the kind of what I think is the psychological astuteness of this little narrative, that many people, this is true of a successful, accomplished, intelligent people, at some point, sometimes multiple times, they have what has been termed in the popular literature, the imposter syndrome. They're doing something, they're even doing it with competence, and yet they don't feel that they're truly authentic, that they don't feel like they're the ones that should be doing this. And we've known about this for a long time. It came to light in a new way in contemporary culture about 15 years into the women's movement, when vast numbers of women had joined the workplace and began to talk about this, that they did not feel, even though they were, I was just talking to some folks, and I do chaplaincy for the Federation at the Cleveland Clinic. It's a very interesting place to do pastoral care, because it's very different than Hillcrest Hospital, for instance, in terms of the census there and the people that are there. The clinic it's almost all surgical, and it's much of it is complex surgery. And so it's just an interesting, and patients are there from all over. But I bumped into some people I knew there, and then we were talking, and we got on the subject of all of the research shows, not only do women prefer women physicians, right? And we know that from the research but there's a certain obvious nature to that. But men prefer women physicians statistically. And so the question is, what's the reason? And I very facilely said, it's because the women are better listeners. And I was talking to a husband and wife, and the woman said, well, and smarter too. So she didn't hesitate for a second. But people feel like I'm not authentic. I'm not legitimate. I don't have the right to be doing this. And so from this kind of sensitivity to the imposter syndrome, there's been a lot more research done on it. And it's not just women, men feel it as well. It gets to the idea of identity development, by which I mean, it's when you go to, in this crowd, I'll talk about, when you go to graduate school, right? Not everybody did, I know, but lots of you did. And you train for a profession. You're going to be, it doesn't have to be graduate school. You're going to be an accountant. You're going to be a physician. You're going to be an attorney, right? It isn't simply the knowledge of the field that you need to learn. You have to develop an identity. This is true in rabbinical school also. You have to develop that identity.
That's right.
And inhabit it, right? And let it inhabit you. And that's not always so automatic.
You have to practice it.
That's one way people
Inhabit it,
come to
practice
inhabit
it,
it,
yeah.
right? And I have a little bit of a particular contemporary interest in this, because my son, who is, God willing, going to finish his PhD by the end of this calendar year, this is the area of research that he's delving in, which is how educational systems instill not just the curriculum, but instill identity
Yeah.
Okay, right? It's amazing, it's because it has to happen.
That's right.
And when you can do that, that's a big aid to overcome that imposter syndrome. But I think lots of us at some point in our lives have felt that. One way that many people can relate to that has nothing to do with their professional life, their work life or anything. Every new parent has that sensation of, what am I doing? I have no idea. I have, you remember that moment of panic when they put the baby in the car seat and let you leave the hospital with newborn, especially if it was your first. You're like, why are you people doing this? Don't you know that I don't have any idea what to do next? Right? I mean, that's like the paradigm of imposter syndrome. Amazing. And the Ellie's, yes.
Talking about beginning a career, beginning this new experience, what about the psychological process of stepping back, retiring from it after one has a strong identity with that?
Absolutely.
That's awesome.
For a lot of people, I think this is, I don't, this is a generalization. I don't think that it's necessarily sexist, but it's a generalization that for lots of people, especially men, whose identity is completely wrapped up in their profession, retirement is very hard, right? And sometimes we see a real psychological decline. Right? I thought my wife retired from medicine just over 2 years ago. And I thought that maybe after a year away from clinical medicine, maybe she'd want to go back and, 20%, 30% time and do it's a thought that occurred to me. It apparently never occurred to her. She has zero interest in going back to clinical medicine. And I think that's largely influenced by, I think I've talked about this before. Some of you know, not only do we have 2 grandchildren that live here in town and a third in Israel, but the 2 that live here in town live next door to us, which is I got pretty great. And then, and they're members here, right?
Yes.
The most important part of their life, their members. But of course, their membership here began to have me come to B'nai Yeshurun on a more frequent basis. And I felt a little funny eating your kiddush food and not being a member, so I took out a membership. That was a good, but I had years ago when I started the shul, which clearly represents an alternative to synagogue membership. There were a couple of things going on. One is that I knew it was important to belong to a synagogue for my family, so that when people criticize me to say, oh, what you're stopping people from being members, I can say, I belong to a synagogue. I believe in synagogue membership. And I did then, and I still do. But the other thing is that what I was doing was already not in the religious realm of my youngest. So we said, Roxanne and I said to him, so, pick a synagogue and we'll join. And he was at Agnon at the time, and I was pretty sure where we were gonna join because of where most of his friends were. Yeah, Mike, where most of his friends were. And so we wound up joining Shari Tikva. But it was very interesting. My point in all that is it was very interesting for about a 6-8 month period. We were shul shopping. And instead of being on the rabbinic side of things, I got to be on the prospective member side. And I got to see how different synagogues, because we really checked out a lot of synagogues, because some of you may know, I'm actually ordained a Reform rabbi. I've never served a Reform congregation, but I'm ordained a Reform rabbi. And then served in a number of other capacities, including a conservative synagogue, which was down the road and is now here. I left because I didn't like what was going on, and then they hired the new person, told the congregation that new rabbi was what we call a turnaround person. And 3.5 years later, I said she turned it around and drove it down the street. But so no, that's for sure. I'm not putting that on her in any way. But I'll still say for the sake of the joke, that's so we got to see what it was. Okay. Yes, Larry.
I was gonna say, you said earlier, and maybe, and maybe in line with what we're saying now is, Moses coming from the palace, felt like an imposter with the, in his role speaking to the oppressed. One interpretation is that when it says earlier, in an earlier portion, that Moses went among the people, is that he wanted to know what it was like. He wanted to feel more what it's like to be oppressed. So among the people is interpreted as he spent some time with the oppressed and got a sense of what it's like to be oppressed. So I mean, he certainly didn't grow up that way. He didn't remain that way. So but he did have a taste. So for what it's
Right.
worth.
And we're not gonna dwell on it this morning. But you could spend a whole study session and then some on Moshe's identity, right? He is born into a Hebrew family that are enslaved. He's hidden by his mother. Then he's, in a way, abandoned by her for his own protection, right? But, and then rescued by the king's daughter, right, by the princess, and grows up in the royal household. Imagine the kind of internal conflict that he must have felt about being of one group and yet growing up in this luxury. And then what made me think of this was your point, that when he goes out among the people, Nebish, he winds up seeing a Hebrew being beaten, and then sometime afterwards, the Torah makes it seem like it's the next day. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. He sees two Hebrews fighting, right? And he enters. So his entry into walking amongst the people was not an easy one, right? So I mean, you could do a whole very deep, and people have, kind of psychological study of Moses's interior life and so on. Sheila, and then I want to move on.
What's also interesting is that you have the story, when you talk about his former life and whatnot, Miriam appears, the mother and father disappeared totally from the story, in the Bible, right? I don't think
Well, except that his mother is brought back in as his wet nurse.
no, but I mean, after that.
Okay, all right,
The others
yeah.
are gone. Miriam is mentioned. Aaron isn't mentioned at the beginning, but once Moshe becomes the leader, Miriam and Aaron are suddenly brought back into the story. I don't know, it's
Right,
it's like trying to make a connection.
it's a complex family, and of course Moses, Moses grew up in a lot of ways as an adopted child, right? And so he carried that with him. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about Moses. I want to look at verses 3:11, which is going to put us on to
Going back,
not page, chapter and verse.
it's going back. To Exodus 3,
What did I say?
3:11. Do you mean 6:11?
No, I really do mean 3:11. We are going, yes. I got a little confused there. I do mean 3:11, however, in which Moses, right, which I didn't read. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt?" And God said, "I will be with you. That shall be your sign." Now jump ahead to 4:1, still last week's parsha. But Moses spoke up and said, "What if they do not believe me and do not listen to me?" And then in 4:10 and 11, Moses said to Lord, "Please, O Lord, I have never been a man of words." He Moshe El Adonai, Bi Adonai lo ish devarim. Right? Literally, I am not a man of words. And it goes on, either in times past or now that I've spoken to your servant, that you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech. This is the end of verse 10. Ki kavad peh. Ukavad.
Heavy.
The first one is, the second one is heavy tongue, right? That would be mouth, right? So one translation, is it here or is it somewhere else? I saw this week. I'm a man of, we often talk about him having some kind of speech impediment, right? So whether it was a stutter or a cleft lip and cleft palate that caused the speech impediment, but yet there may have been a physical defect. It might have been psychological, we don't know, but we talk about some kind of speech impediment.
Vocabulary.
What's that?
Could even have just been limited vocabulary.
Maybe, but I don't know. That seems to me to be the weakest interpretation. I don't think that really works that well. It's, but the interpretation, the translation I saw was, I'm a man of occluded speech. I like that. That appealed to me. Occluded, blocked, shut up, obstructed, right? That might even be a better word. I'm
You
a
know,
man
that's
obstructed.
why when God said to Moses, where would you like me to take the people? And he said, slow of speech. He meant to say, God said, okay, I'm going to take you to Canaan, but he meant to say Canada, which would have been a lot easier in our history.
Instead, if Moses hadn't listened to God and would have just turned would have turned right instead of left, Israel would be the land that is now Saudi Arabia, and we'd be sitting on all that oil. Think of how the last 100+ years would be different. But that's my own little, we're gonna get to that because I have a whole thing at the end of this about if I were king. Now, so here's what I want to get to. I want to compare that to the opening of, and you don't need to turn the pages, I already did here, to the opening of the book of Deuteronomy. These are the words that Moses addressed. This is at the end of the 40 years. Remember, the book of Deuteronomy takes place in basically the last month of Moses's life. He's been leading them for 40 years. And now we're talking about this man, and that's what they call him, Ish Devarim, a man of words. Initially, he says, I'm not a man of words, but he grows and develops
Into a man of
whatever it
words.
is. Okay.
That's a word.
And this is emphasizing for us a core component of Jewish theology as it applies to each of us in our everyday lives. It deeply, deeply ties in to the work, the spiritual and psychological work that we each do surrounding the high holidays. And that is this story of Moses beginning as a man of occluded speech, becoming an Ish Devarim, a man of words. This is emphasizing for us our human ability to grow and to change and
Yeah.
develop, right? Which, by the way, cycles back to something I said earlier about when we're in crisis of some kind or facing problems, our ability to see solutions and alternative solutions and to not get stuck. Now, one of the reasons sometimes we get stuck when we're in crisis is it feels risky to take some kind of leap and to do something we haven't done before. But sometimes it's exactly that risk, right, that we need to take. But here we have Moses as an example, really a paradigm of our human ability to grow. I'm gonna come back to that thought, but I have.
Well, I think it's related to what you say about the imposter syndrome at the beginning.
Thank you.
He didn't feel like he could do this. Who am I to do this? I can't even speak. I'm not confident. He didn't say that. And by the end of everything he's gone through, now he has grown and now he can do it because he has grown into that position as the leader.
Right. And let's not forget, it took 40 years, right? And it goes back to your comment about, we might talk about career identity, but what about identity when we retire, right? We're at the tail end of that 40-year period.
But what's also an alternative commentary on that is that God chose Moses because he was not a man of words, and he would be more susceptible, better able to communicate God's words, God's demands and desires to the people.
Okay, where'd you get that from? Do you remember?
I think I read it, maybe Jonathan Sachs or someone
Got
like that.
got it.
And
That's
also
a good source.
another thing in terms of imposter syndrome, you remember God at the beginning, there are three miracles or signs that God gives Moses to give, with his staff and so forth. But the second one was he tells him to put his hand in his cloak, and it comes out in like leprosy, white as snow. Remember that?
Yeah, right here.
Okay, so that turns out to be a punishment in some commentaries, because he never uses that with Pharaoh. And he does that right after Moses says that God tells him what he has to tell the people about him taking them out of Egypt. And he says, the people won't believe me. And it's a punishment for not having faith in the people. You can't be a leader unless you have faith in the people. In other words, he has the right to doubt himself as a leader, but he does not have the right to doubt the people.
Right. Despite all the trouble they give him. I want to come back to this point here about our human growth, because we have to ask the question, why does the Torah, and more generally Jewish thought, why does it spend so much time and energy making this, emphasizing this and making this point that we can grow and develop? Because on the one hand, it seems like it would be obvious. And I think it's part of the answer to that is that our ancestors, and I would never want to describe our ancestors as silly or ignorant or anything else along those lines. They were I've said this before here in this group, they were pre-scientific, right? They did not live in a scientific era like we do. And they didn't have, and they lived pre-Freud, so they didn't have psychology as we define it, but they certainly had psychological insight, right? They did have an understanding of human beings in lots of different ways. And so what we come across, I talk about this in a different vein with premarital couples when I'm talking about when I'm doing my premarital counseling with them, right? That our basic personalities are formed and to a large degree fairly fixed by the time we're finished with young childhood.
Yeah.
Right? So, and I talk about that with premarital couples because lots of you around the table are or have been married, and you know that one of the things you could never do was change your spouse, right? Now, I try and emphasize that as a positive. You fell in love with them because of who they were, and why would you want to change them? So it is the case that our basic personality and our makeup, likes and dislikes, that is pretty much fixed, depending on which developmental psychology textbook you're reading, somewhere between the time we're 4 to 7 or 8 years old.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced that our ancestors recognize that also. I mean, we're getting to do it again. My wife and I are getting to do it again with our grandchildren as we're seeing them grow, right? And they're 2.5 and 3 and 3.5. Because we're already beginning to see certain types of personality traits. Who's more outgoing? Who's quieter? Which one's a risk taker physically? These are the kinds of things, right? We did it when we were parents. Now we're getting to see it again. And so there's a lot about us that's fairly fixed. What can we change? Behaviors. we can change behavior. When there's some catalyst, when there's some benefit, when there's something that we gain, some positive we derive, we can in fact change behavior. And the best example I can give you of this, I think I've used this example here before, is that if we couldn't change behavior, no alcoholic or drug addict would ever be able to go into recovery. Right? In other words, a person suffering from addiction can change behavior. They may always have the urge, right? Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they may always have but they can change the behavior. Now that's an extreme example, right? And I think it's of some interest to me because when my father was a young man and I don't remember it, I remember the story, but I don't remember it because I was too little. And my father was in sales his whole life. And he got into sales management, but he was involved in sales his whole life. He used to tell us, any of you that were salespeople will know this already, that he used to say he lost money on every sale, but he made it up in volume. So, that's an old salesman joke. He got 2 nodules on his vocal cord. And they had to be removed. And he was terrified he was going to lose his voice. And his doctor told him, stop smoking. My father smoked unfiltered Camel cigarettes. He was a veteran of the World War II from the Army, and I think that's where he picked it up. And he quit cold turkey. And it took my mother another few years to stop smoking. But because I was old enough to remember when she quit. To her dying day, my mother said she always missed the after dinner cigarette. She never lost that urge, right? She said, I want to sit down with a cup of coffee and my after dinner cigarette. Right? And she had not smoked for, I don't know how long at that point, 30 plus years, maybe longer. So we know we can change behavior. Whatever it is that we might struggle with, we don't have to be controlled by it in terms of how we act. And this is an important point in marriage, that we can't change our partner, but we and they can change our behavior towards one another. My wife has a long list of behaviors I should change. And the ones I've managed to attain, I'm gonna have an easier life for it, right?
She also has a honeydew.
So, yeah, which is all about all the changes I should make about life. And we can change behavior. And I think this is just so ingrained in, I'm almost out of time, so I'm gonna move on from this point. This is so ingrained in a kind of a Jewish spiritual psychological orientation of how we live our lives. And that's the whole thrust of the High Holy Days. We examine the year. What are we supposed to do? Examine the year past. We're not asked to examine our whole lives. That would be onerous. You couldn't do it. If you had to go back and look at every mistake you ever made, oh my God, who would do that? But if you do it every year, you only have to go back 1 year, do the atonement, blah, blah, blah. Judaism doesn't say don't make any mistakes or sins in the next year. What it says is don't make the same ones. That's
Have to come up with new things.
And that's what it's getting at. Now, we being creatures of habit tend to make the same ones over and over again, maybe variations on theme.
We know how to do them.
So we know how to do it. Right? When I talk with my premarital couples, I talk about managing and resolving conflict in a marriage. And I try and emphasize to them that chances are they're going to manage most of their conflict. There's very little conflict that they will actually resolve. We learn to live with our differences, right? And I say, if I were a betting man, the things, and I have them identify, and these are engaged couples. They're in a courtship, lovey-dovey state, right? And most of the couples I marry who are marrying for the first time are in their late 20s to early 30s. And I say to them, I ask them to identify, well, even if they're little things, what are the kinds of things that you have conflict about now that cause friction between the two of you? And even couples that are deeply in love and waiting to get married can identify friction points, right? And I say to them, if I were a betting man, if I ask you the same question a year from now, and 3 years from now, and 30 years from now,
Same answer.
It's gonna be the same thing or slight variation, because we are who we are, right? We're creatures of habit. Okay. I just want to make that point about how deep in Judaism, how deeply ingrained this idea of that we can grow, we can develop, right? And that's a lifelong process. We are always a work in process, if you will. Okay, now I want to, because I'm not only running out of time, I'm out of time. It talks about Pharaoh's heart being hardened. There's a lot of commentary written about that. Does that impinge on Pharaoh's free will? All very interesting. I'm gonna pay no attention to it this morning. The point I want to make is that at the end of a yoga class 15 years ago, 18 years ago, I was taking, the instructor, the teacher at the end of the class said, by way of kind of, bringing us back into the world, soften your eyes, soften your face, soften your heart. I remembered this and I wrote it down. So I thought it was very wise. Soften your eyes. That's how we see things in the world, right? Don't see things harshly. And it also has to do with kind of our approach to the world and giving people the benefit of the doubt and all those things. Soften your face and soften your heart. This soft heart allows us to bend like a reed, to be flexible, to be understanding, to be compassionate, to be empathic. That's the soft heart. This is what Pharaoh lacked. Now, I just want to make one other comment that I wrote in a Devar Torah a few years ago, related to this parsha, but related to lots of the parshas. Last night I said at my dinner table, I get an hour to teach. I have about 2.5 hours worth of material. I gotta figure out what I'm doing. This whole story of the Exodus, which we tell at Passover, leads up to Revelation, which we're not there yet. You're gonna get to it soon with whoever is teaching that particular week. This leads to, but Exodus, the slavery, the liberation from it, is a necessary condition to lead to Revelation. And among contemporary Jews, particularly non-Orthodox contemporary Jews, there is question about authorship of the Torah, who wrote the Torah, what is its source, and so on. And all very interesting. And I've been trained one way and you've studied with different people who have different views. But here's what I want to say about it in an approach to studying and understanding Torah. That at least for me personally, whatever I believe about authorship of Torah, et cetera, I do, and this clearly falls under the category of faith statement. I do believe that there was something that happened to our people in the desert in those years, some moment of group revelation. I don't know exactly what it was. I don't know exactly what got written down. In other words, then we get into all of the subplots. But the point being that I think there was something that was unique. Every time we study Torah, that's ongoing revelation. We learn new things. But I think there was a unique, singular, one time, 3 ways that say the same thing.
Very quick or something.
Experience that our ancestors had. And that's a collective consciousness that dwells within every Jew. And I really do carry that with me. That is my kind of the underpinning to all of my Torah study. The liturgy, particularly Shabbat morning, right? The whole thrust of the service is to re-experience revelation. We come in sleepy at 9, it starts at 9 o'clock here, the service next door, right? And we work our way up in a number of steps. There's the introductory prayers, Sukol de Zimra, the Amidah. I'm sorry, I skipped over the Shema section of the service. The Amidah, all is an ascension to revelation. When we open the ark, take out the Torah, literally touch it and kiss it, and then reveal it. There's a whole aspect of eros to the Torah service, by the way, if you've never noticed that. It'll make the services much more interesting if you've already felt it. The only way I can tolerate sitting in services. We open up the Torah, we read it publicly, right? And that is, we are re-experiencing the revelation. We ascend the mountain, we reach this, that's the peak experience. Is reading Torah.
Because he
And
doesn't
then,
want it.
and then what do we do
Oh, yeah.
right after that? We lift it up and expose the Torah, right, in all of its nakedness to the congregation. Right? And there is this aspect, and let me just finish this real quickly and then we'll be done. We ascend the mountain, we have this peak experience, and what do we know about peak experiences?
They come down.
To come down.
They're wonderful,
They don't
they're
last.
enlivening, you can't live there. And that's Musaf, right? You gotta come back down. And if we entered here and we ascended to here, we come back down and hopefully we leave here. And the delta between where we started and where we came out, that's inspiration. And when we can do that, to me, that's a successful service. If you come out at the exact same place that you went in, your service leaders failed you and you failed, right? Because we're supposed to be in a different place spiritually
Yes.
at the end of services than when we came in. Easy to describe, very challenging to accomplish. Thank you. We've gone over 5 or 7 minutes. I appreciate that.